At around 11 o'clock on the night of November 28, 1981, off the coast of Santa Catalina Island near Southern California, the actress Natalie Wood went missing. During a break in filming her current movie, she had been on a yacht with her husband, Robert Wagner, along with her co-star Christopher Walken. The next morning, her body was found, face down, floating in the Pacific Ocean, riddled with bruises and cuts. This would go on to become a Hollywood firestorm-turned-legend, steeped in rumor, accusations, and speculation, still unresolved over 40 years later and still overpowering the legacy of one of Hollywood's greatest actresses. Almost 2 years after her death, that movie she'd been working on was finally released, shamelessly marketing itself as Natalie Wood's final performance. It is an unfortunate reality of show business that people can die suddenly while leaving something unfinished, but the show must go on. There are countless examples of successful, well-remembered movies that were completed in the absence of a major player. For Natalie Wood, though, her last picture has been all but forgotten, which I don't think is fair. So today, we're going to take a deep dive into Brainstorm.
They would have you murdered. All you'll ever be.
Imagine if you could put on a headset and record your full and complete experience. The sights, the sounds, the tastes, the smells, and the feelings, and then share them with someone else. This is the technological breakthrough of Drs. Brace and Reynolds, who foresee endless possibilities in entertainment, medicine, science, and communication. However, the military wants in on the tech, and as she resists her work being used to kill, Dr. Reynolds dies of a fatal heart attack, recording her last moments in the headset. It is then up to Dr. Brace to keep control of the technology long enough to find out what she experienced and what it could teach us about the universe.
It's been a while since I've gotten to talk about one of my favorite special effects icons, the late Douglas Trumbull. His extensive resume includes 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Andromeda Strain, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and Star Trek: The Motion Picture, all of which I've already covered on this channel. He also wrote and directed Silent Running, and even though that movie wasn't a commercial success, he was considered a rising star and a director with untapped potential. He spent nearly a decade trying to get various other projects off the ground as a director, but he had a remarkable run of bad luck that included studio heads axing projects that had already been greenlit, financiers getting cold feet, and more. In 1981, Trumbull was finally able to get something going, and in order to keep himself financially afloat, he agreed to work on Ridley Scott's Blade Runner until halfway through production, after which he'd move on to his own project. Trumbull was obsessed with upping the frame rate of film and widening the aspect ratio, believing that the future was in a high-fidelity, ultra-cinematic experience. Thus, he developed what he called ShowScan, which utilized 70mm film at a blistering 60 frames a second, itself a compromise as Trumbull wanted to go even higher. For his next film, he wanted to display ShowScan to the world, to make audiences feel like they did back when film was brand new, when people quaked in fear of trains speeding towards them on the silver screen. Of course, the logistics of this, requiring a massive infrastructure change that theaters and the industry at large certainly weren't ready for yet, crushed Trumbull's dream as prohibitively expensive. Enter Bruce Joel Rubin, another man I've talked about on this channel before. Rubin, now known in film circles mostly for writing Ghost and Jacob's Ladder, had written a screenplay called The George Dunlap Tape, a trippy, metaphysical script centering around the technology we see in the final film, give or take a few key details. In 1973, Rubin himself nearly directed it, but the investor pulled out. Trumbull, who had first gotten his hands on the script in 1977, pared it down into something more manageable with the help of writer Robert Stitzel, and retitled it Brainstorm. Instead of utilizing decades ahead of its time technology to up the frame rate, Trumbull instead opted to change the aspect ratio during the course of the film. For the regular scenes, it would be shot in 35mm with regular sound, but for the POV shots within the headset, it would blow out to 70mm with full surround sound. It wasn't as dramatic as Trumbull had hoped for with ShowScan, but he felt it was sufficient to give the movie a special punch. Hey, have you hit that like button yet? If not, I'd really appreciate it if you did. And if you really do like what I'm doing, please consider subscribing as well. If you want to support what I do even more, you can also check out my Patreon to get access to bonus content, vote on future topics, and more. I also have a bunch of other things to promote, like my book, my podcasts, my website, and my Discord server, which are all linked in the description below. With all that out of the way, let's move on. MGM was heavily invested in Brainstorm. It had a relatively hefty budget of $12.5 million at that point, so Trumbull didn't skimp on the casting, hiring 3 Academy Award winners in major roles. The primary lead, Dr. Michael Brace, is played by Christopher Walken, who had won his Oscar for The Deer Hunter. Prior to filming, Trumbull did 2 weeks of table reads and script rehearsals where he encouraged improvisation. This led to Walken offering multiple changes to the story and script, much to the frustration of the writer, and began a behind-the-scenes trend where, according to insiders, the actors ran amok while the director was more focused on the special effects. Walken's wife, Georgianne, also appears in Brainstorm as Wendy. Dr. Brace's research partner / secondary love interest, Dr. Reynolds, is played by Louise Fletcher, who replaced the first choice, Glenda Jackson, and who got her Oscar for playing Nurse Ratched in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I would be remiss not to mention that she would later play the you-love-to-hate Bajoran fundamentalist Kai Wynn in Star Trek Deep Space Nine. She agreed to a slight pay cut in order to work with Trumbull, but she put in the work, doing extracurricular research into heart attacks and interviewing survivors in order to prepare for her grueling death scene. Fletcher's performance in Brainstorm is easily the one that stands out the most, and it would net her a Saturn Award. The third and final Oscar winner to be cast was Uncle Ben himself, Cliff Robertson, who plays the pair's duplicitous CEO Alex Turson. Robertson, whose Academy Award came from 1968's Charlie, was a controversial choice, given that he had been largely responsible for blowing the whistle on Columbia Pictures president David Begelman for the check-writing scandal that led to his firing. Begelman was, at the time of Robertson's casting in Brainstorm, the president of MGM, but allegedly he held no ill will towards the actor. The fourth and final lead, Michael's nearly estranged wife Karen Brace, is played by Natalie Wood, who beat out Kate Jackson for the part. Wood was a Hollywood icon, having gotten her start as a child actress in such classics as Rebel Without a Cause, The Searchers, and of course West Side Story, in which she plays Maria. A rarity in Hollywood, she had managed to successfully transition well into adulthood with her star power intact. However, in the 1970s, she took an extended hiatus from acting in order to raise her 2 children. By the early 80s, though, she was ready to make her comeback, and Hollywood was ready to welcome her with open arms. To prepare for the movie, Trumbull had most of the cast, Wood was exempted because she'd already done this, attend sessions at the New Age Esalen Institute in Northern California, where they would engage in various forms of guided meditation, a quote-unquote rebirthing seminar, and more. Louise Fletcher was vocal about finding it all a bit silly, but being a true professional, she still participated in everything. Trumbull had hoped to have the actors take drugs that simulate life after death, but those drugs weren't legal, not even at the Esalen Institute. After this trip, the cast and crew flew out to North Carolina, where filming began in late September of 1981. Locations include the Elian Hitchens Building in Research Park, and the Wright Brothers National Monument in the bizarrely named Kill Devil Hills. With the location shooting completed, production then moved to Culver City back in California in early November. With only 2 weeks of principal photography to go, there was a break for the Thanksgiving holiday. during which Natalie Wood would drown under a cloud of sordid speculation. To say Wood's passing nearly scuttled the entire production would be to undersell just how devastating this was to Brainstorm. Wood was slated to film several critical scenes that included close-ups, and MGM execs feared that without those scenes, the movie wouldn't work. Filming came to a halt, and the press began reporting that the movie was likely to be cancelled altogether. Trumbull fought back against this, believing he could salvage things with a few script changes, but he couldn't stop MGM from filing potential insurance claims with Lloyd's of London and Pacific Indemnity, through which they hoped to recover the over $10 million investment the studio had already put into the movie. Ultimately, Lloyd's of London sided with Trumbull and supplied $3 million for the film's completion, which from an investment standpoint is pretty simple math. Better to spend $3 million they might be able to recoup than to give MGM $15 million they'd never see again. MGM had lost faith in the project, though, and fed into the rumor mill the idea that the studio might sell the film to a third party, leaking choice quotes from executives about Brainstorm being, quote, fatally flawed, unquote. Still, in early February of 1982, filming finally resumed, with Joe Dorsey's character, Hal, taking over one of Wood's important scenes, retroactively disturbing canoeing and drowning scenes removed, and a few other script workarounds put in place. Most of the cast and crew were able to return, though there was a conspicuous absence of producer John Foreman, or anybody representing the interests of MGM, signaling how much they had lost faith in the movie. Principal photography wrapped in March, but that was far from the end of Trumbull's woes. Trumbull hadn't received a salary due to the work stoppage, and had vocally stated he was going to renegotiate his contract with MGM. He attempted to screen the film for studio execs in April, but they walked out after seeing Trumbull's list of unfinished special effects scenes that he was planning on completing in post. The execs, accusing Trumbull of deception, seized the movie, preventing other studios from screening it for a potential sale, and of course stopping Trumbull once again from finishing it. However, by the summer, with accusations flying and threats of more insurance claims or even lawsuits being mentioned to the press, MGM finally agreed to screen the film for the other studios, with only Paramount, which had ironically given the project to MGM in the first place, making an offer. That is, at least according to MGM. Trumbull disputed all of this, arguing that MGM was flailing, making excuses, and outright lying. As Trumbull saw it, he was standing in the way of their $15 million insurance payout, and the studio was doing everything in its power to stop him, from getting dubious legal documents signed by members of his crew, to trying to force him into meetings that Trumbull's lawyer insisted he not attend. In Trumbull's recollection, he was something of a basket case, fearing not only for his movie and his career, but also for his life. It wouldn't be until October before Lloyd's of London finally agreed to pay out an additional $3.5 million for Trumbull to finish his movie, with MGM agreeing to distribute the film through United Artists. There was some very brief additional photography, but most of the work that remained was entirely effects, done through Trumbull's own company. Originally slated for a summer release, the movie was delayed several times, ultimately coming out on September 30th, 1983, a full 2 years after filming had initially begun. And it flopped, making only $10.2 million at the box office, losing business to The Big Chill, which released at the same time. Critics were tepid on it, praising the ideas, the effects, and the acting, but criticizing the sloppy directing, muddled story, and choppy editing. In its wake, Trumbull, fully disillusioned, quit Hollywood altogether, taking his grand technological ideas into the theme park business. He would later team back up with Steven Spielberg to work on Universal's Back to the Future ride, but otherwise, he stayed away from Tinseltown until his death from cancer in 2022. As for Brainstorm, it has earned a slight reputation as a cult classic, but is mostly forgotten by wider audiences. It did influence Hollywood going forward, inspiring Peter Jackson's tinkering with high frame rates in the early 2000s, and sharing more than a few similarities to a few cyberpunk hits, most notably The Lawnmower Man and one of my personal favorites, Strange Days, which won't turn 30 until late next year. So here's the thing. Brainstorm is an essential film in the history of sci-fi cinema that deserves to be remembered. But when it comes to the actual film, I have to largely side with the critics on this one. It feels like an unfinished movie, and not just because of the long production pauses or the unfortunate death of Natalie Wood. Even without those not inconsequential problems, Brainstorm fell victim to Trumbull's emphasis on effects over story. There is a great story in there, and I've got to get my hands on Bruce Joel Rubin's original screenplay, but it feels like a lot of connective tissue is missing between scenes. The plot hobbles along with a few jarring shifts in tone. The best example is the sudden slapstick humor during an otherwise emotionally dense climax about death and the afterlife, and you can definitely feel that there are scenes missing. The technology itself, which is the focus of the plot, is also underexplained in places, such as when it is learned that emotions and memories can be transferred without there being any explanation as to what that entails or what the narrative rules of it would be. Still, the film shines in its performances, in its effects, and in its big ideas. This is a forward-thinking movie dealing in issues of technology and metaphysics that wouldn't become mainstream until the internet age. Sure, there's the bog-standard tension between scientists working for the common good coming up against the military-industrial complex, but that's so rote it feels almost obligatory, never cohering into anything thematically relevant to the majority of the characters. Nevertheless, like I said, Brainstorm is still an impressive film that just never got out of the shadow of the loss of two of Hollywood's most promising talents, Natalie Wood and Douglas Trumbull. Its legacy may be stained and its troubled production may have resulted in a flawed movie, but Brainstorm is absolutely a sci-fi classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. How do you think Hollywood should deal with the loss of a star in the middle of making a film? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching, and until next time, when we'll get very, very wet, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love, as long as you're not hurting anybody.
You blew my socks off.